Welcome to Women Who Move Nations, a podcast by the Public Transport Association, Australia-New Zealand.
Each episode, we interview top female executives from the public transport sector in Australia, New Zealand, and around the world.
If you're interested in leadership, workplace gender equality, or building clean, green transport for the future, this is the podcast for you. Now here's your host, Michelle Batsis.
Hello and welcome to our episode of Women Who Move Nations. This is the first episode of our new series. It's Michelle Batsis here. I'm the Executive Director of Future Mobility at the Department of Transport and Planning in Victoria, Australia. And I'm super excited to have our guest with us today. It's Veronica Davis. She is a self-proclaimed transport nerd, author and former director of transportation and drainage in the city of Houston in Texas in the US. So super excited to have Veronica here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we're just going to kick straight into the discussion, Veronica. I am so impressed with your career. You have done so many things. I have read your bio, I've Googled you, engineer, planner, project manager, consultant, co-founder, director, also author, as I mentioned, and we're going to unpack that in a little bit. But I just thought it would be so great for our listeners to hear around, what have been your career highlights and how have you made those career choices along the way? Because you've obviously done so many different things.
I'll say that for my career highlights, believe it or not, it's the points where my career completely veered off track. And I think that's the place where you learn the most. And my short career story, I started at the federal government, at the U.S. federal government, U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration. And from there, I went to a private sector company doing consulting. And it was a really great firm, but the work was not in my sweet spot. So I spent about 2.5 years doing engineering work, but more on the water resources side and solid waste management, which was not what I was trained for. And then from there, I went to local government. I worked as an urban planner, doing neighborhood plans, more zoning, vertical, looking at space and how cities are designed. And then I had my own company for 11 years. And so when I really think about those milestones, it's things that took me off track. But as I had my last position as the director of transportation and drainage operations, everything up until that point I did at my job, where I had veered off from transportation to do water resources. When you have drainage, you're dealing with water resources. When I was working for the city as a planner, a lot of what I was dealing with was drainage, flooding, and not just from rain, just, high tide flooding. And so even though things felt at the time that they didn't fit, I really have been able to pull on that experience in my most recent position.
Amazing. I love that you've kind of done different things, but the reflection that it's around veering off and then those opportunities have really kind of influenced where you've gone and the achievements you've made. That's fantastic. Okay, so that leads into my next question. You recently left your role as the Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations at the City of Houston. And I'm really interested to hear around what are your reflections on that experience? And perhaps you can share with our audience what's an achievement that you're most proud of during that role.
So yes, I just recently left my role as the Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations for the City of Houston. When I look back at that role, and it's very interesting, I was on an interview panel for someone who was looking to be an executive within the city, and they asked what I thought they needed to be successful. And the biggest thing I said was, you really take care of your financials at home. I think a lot of times when people think about leadership, they think about the type of leadership, but very practically for those type of positions, you really need to take care of home and be in a place where you are financially sound, because the minute you need the job for your life, it makes it hard to make the decisions that you need to make. And that's what, even in my book, Inclusive Transportation, a Manifesto for Repairing Divided Communities, I talk about bold leadership. And part of being in bold leadership is the willingness to stand up for what you believe is the right thing and being willing to accept any of the consequences that come from that. And as I reflect back on my time, we got a lot of great things done. And the reason why it's a very unique title in Houston, it is very flat and the soil is clay. And then the streets are part of the drainage system. So they're very tied together in a way that you don't see in other cities. As I look back on the accomplishments, I would say it's really two things that stand out for me. One is the amount of federal funding that we were able to bring to the city under the Biden administration's bipartisan infrastructure law. We brought in over $100 million for transportation projects that are largely going to go in Black and Brown communities and areas of persistent poverty. And so that is a huge contribution, that we were able to make. And the other part that I'm extremely proud of is being able to change the culture. I'm the first woman to serve in this role over this particular group, and to be able to really bring the things I feel that are great about being a woman, being able to bring that nurturing, being able to bring the bigger vision, and to work with the team to bring them together, to work collaboratively. And the end result is when you look at the data and all of the metrics, they all went up under my leadership.
Thanks for sharing, Veronica. You said something, this concept of bold leadership. I loved that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this concept that the willingness to stand up for what is right.
Absolutely. And I was just giving the example of a talk recently. And, a very tangible example of what that looks like is Betty White, who is an American actress that many people love. She had a very long career in Hollywood. But one of the things that happened early in her career, she had the Betty White show in the 1950s. This, in the United States context, was at a time that we still had segregation, and very much legalized segregation, which was a doctrine called separate but equal. And therefore, colors at that time and white people were completely separate. And Betty White had this show, and on this show, she had a Black man who was a dancer. And she was basically told that she needed to remove him from the show. And she said, absolutely not. And that is bold leadership, to be able to stand and say, I'm not going to do that. This is my show, and this is how I want this show to be run. And the end result was she lost the show. But because she stood up, and she did lose something in that, she ended up having a really great career in Hollywood, and the fact that she was so loved in Hollywood. And that, to me, that is what bold leadership is.
I love that example. I love Betty White, actually. I watched The Golden Girls on repeat when I was younger. You mentioned there some really interesting issues, and I think that really leads well into my next question, because I wanted to talk about your book that you've just published. You referred to earlier, the title being Inclusive Transportation, a Manifesto for Repairing Divided Communities. And Veronica, I wanted to ask you, what was your inspiration for writing this book? And what are the key takeaways that you can share with our listeners?
Writing a book. I never thought I would do it. But, when I think about the inspiration, part of it came from, I was working on a project and I was presenting at a conference, as many of us in the field do. And this woman walks up to me and was like, I loved everything you said. You should write it in a book. And I was like, okay. She ended up being my first editor at Island Press. But I sat down and wrote the book. And part of it is being able to tell my story. Again, in the U.S. context, a lot of our highway system was built during this era of segregation and largely destroyed Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, literally splitting them in half in some cases. And the residual effects are, people have been displaced from the community. And I share my family story in East Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where Interstate 10, which connects the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. So it starts in Florida and then goes to California in the East-West. And with that, the area that my mom grew up in, was destroyed. And my grandparents' home was taken in order to build the highway. And I think that, for many of us, particularly in, younger generations, it can feel like these things happened a long time ago. but we're really only one generation removed from many of those decisions. And then when you look at the data today, if you look at where we have high rates of childhood asthma in the United States, if you look at where we have obesity in the United States, it tends to be in these areas around the highways or where we've built really wide roads. And so it was really just sharing that story. Big highlights from the book. I talk about the transportation industry, and I do disclaim that it is very much a U.S. context because of how our systems were built and because our legalized segregation was a little bit different than what you may experience in other countries. However, I do think that the elements are still applicable because while racism looks like one thing in the United States, almost every other country has those same elements of racism, particularly as you look at immigration now that is happening in some of these countries. So it is still very relevant in making sure that we are developing a transportation network centered around what I call the silently suffering. And specifically the silently suffering or that stakeholder that doesn't have time to go to public meetings. They are trying to survive. They are trying to get through the day. They're trying to feed their families. And especially in a United States context where the working poor really don't get the resources that they need. They make too much to get government assistance, but then not enough to truly be thriving. And so that is the group that is the focus of how we should make transportation decisions. But unfortunately, that's not what we do in the United States. And then I end with a call to action. And again, it's a very U.S. context of the transportation industry is really in this push or pull right now where there are still very people who believe in an auto-centric future. But we already know the damage that cars at a mass have done in our country. And we really need to be thinking about other modes of transportation, biking, walking, public transit, and making that real investment because, we know that that is a way that people can thrive if they can access jobs and they can access education.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story there, Veronica, and that personal connection you have to your work. I've never heard of the concept of silently suffering before, but that really resonates. And I think lots of our listeners can take away something from that.
And I think, and while I come at it from a United States context, I do think it is very important for listeners around the globe to take the time to examine within their community who is the silently suffering, because it is going to be different. I went to Salzburg Global Seminar and there were people from all over the world there. And there was someone from a European country that said, well, we don't have the problems of the US. Everyone in my country is white. And that might be true, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people within that country who aren't always left out, who aren't always forgotten. And sometimes, especially as a lot of countries grapple with immigration, a lot of times it is the immigrants into these countries and, trying to start a new life and struggling to be able to get transportation, housing, and all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with this concept of the silently suffering, and like in the book, you remind readers around, reflecting on how to best meet the needs of the communities, that they're planning for, that they're planning transportation for, planning what the city looks like. I'm interested to hear your views around how do the planners make the balancing act work, right? Because we have to listen to the community and what their needs are, but then often that can be conflicting or, there's a trade-off to make because of the government or city goals that are in place. So do you have any advice around what approach that we could be taking in those circumstances?
Absolutely. So one of the things I share in the book, it's a project that I did in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, and it was for a bus priority transit project. And, typically how engagement is done, there's a meeting in a stale elementary, gym or elementary lunchroom. And usually the people that show up are what I call the champions and the naysayers. And those are the people that are passionate. They either passionately want the project or they passionately don't want the project. And so that's the noise that you get and the conflict
if you will, of the community showing up and trying to balance, whose concerns are what. And so with that, I do talk in the book of, even with the naysayers, it is important to understand what it is that their concerns are, because some of their concerns have some validity, and it could be an access management thing. It could be that they're able to provide some additional context that you can't get, just by studying the corridor. And a specific example, there was on that particular transit project, there was this like informal park and ride that was happening because there was, no residential parking. And so people were driving in and parking in this neighborhood and getting on the bus. And that's why the bus ridership numbers were higher than what they should be based on the land use. But that's something that information you can get from the community. And so this community was concerned if you improve the bus, then they're going to have more people just parking in their neighborhood. And so I think that there's some validity to the naysayers, but, the silently suffering and how we got to them, it's very difficult. And you have to develop an outreach strategy that is truly targeted for them. And we looked at the data for when we could get the highest amount of ridership at certain times of the day. And we set up a public meeting in the bus stop so that as people jumped off the bus, they are in the bus stop with the understanding that once you do that, you have about 2 minutes to get what you need out of this person before they need to go to where they are. And so that's one of the strategies, a very tangible strategy I share in the book about how to reach the silently suffering. But then sometimes, it's going to come down to, and this is, circle back to how we started with bold leadership. Part of it is being very clear on what the goals are, what the vision is, and recognizing that you're not going to always get to consensus. Sometimes you're going to have to make the hard decision that everyone may not like, but it is the right decision.
Yeah, that's great advice. Veronica, when you're talking about, the meetings happen in a school gymnasium, and, I'm just thinking actually, because in Australia, often the community engagement meetings for when there's a proposed design, for new transport ends up happening at, a time of day where people aren't going to make it, that they can't because of their family or their work commitments. And, it's actually groundbreaking and so practical to think, well, you could actually just do it at the bus stop. Yeah. Like go to where your users are. So great advice there. What comes out so strongly listening to you is how passionate you are. I can really hear that passion. And, you've been working in this sector, including in public transport for over 20 years. And I want to ask you, what excites you about it and what's keeping you motivated, to continue pushing for change?
Biggest thing that excites me about transportation is knowing that if we do it right, we can really improve people's lives. I think the two most important things of any community is the quality of the education and the quality of the transportation. That is how people are able to change their outcome, in some cases break generational curses, but that's how people are able to change their outcome in their stations in life. And, unfortunately, in the US context in particular, cars are a status symbol. We look at cars of, lets people know how much money you have. It lets people know, where you might live, and it's used in that way. And so it makes it hard. And people feel like, if you try to take their car away, it's a war on cars. And it really isn't. It's really about just providing more options. And that's really what I'm passionate about. It's, really being able to serve the silently suffering. One of the big trends that we're seeing in the US, I'm not sure if you're seeing it in Australia, but one of the big trends that we're seeing in the US is these kids are not getting driver's license. I couldn't wait to get my driver's license. The fact that I had to wait 2 days after my birthday was rough. But this younger generation, they're not getting their driver's license. And even 25-year-olds that have driver's license, it has dropped significantly in the United States. And so as I think to the future, well, what future are we creating if we're not providing the options for people who've made a very clear statement that said, I choose not to drive? And that's what I'm really just passionate about. I know that we can get there. I know that there are leaders that can get us to where we really need to be as a country and as a nation to make the investment, particularly in public transportation.
PTANS is proud to bring you season 7 of the Women Who Move Nations public transport podcast in partnership with NEC Australia.
With over a century of innovation and a strong commitment to creating a brighter, more inclusive world, NEC is dedicated to gender equality and diverse perspectives and is amplifying the voices of women leaders in public transport.
It's really interesting reflections there. Thank you so much about sharing, kind of what's driving you at that core. It's interesting, isn't it, around the rates of kind of registration for driver's licenses plummeting, because we're also seeing a downturn in Australia, which I think kind of starts to signal really a generational change around how people expect to move, carbon emissions, etc. So, I think what's really struck me is that, with transport, history has really predicted its future in so many ways, right? Like the way that the cities are designed, when you were talking about the way the highways were implemented. But if we just step back and think, if we could just like wave a magic wand and you had the opportunity to design a network from scratch, what would it feature?
I think the biggest thing that a network from scratch would feature is shorter headways. That is like a uniquely US issue where we don't really set up transit to be successful. And there's a lot of things behind that, but I was just talking with some people on social media and they were talking about the Dutch in their investment in bike infrastructure. And my comment was their investment in transit, the fact that I was able to navigate a city where I don't know the language at all, the fact that I could get a train, going 5 to 10 minute headways, even the middle, the late evening on a weekday. It's like the most amazing thing. And so to me, that is the gold standard, versus, even at some of the best US cities, late at night, you're looking at 20-minute headways, maybe 30-minute headways, an hour. And so you don't set it up to be successful, because if I miss the train, I got to wait an hour. No one has time like that. So as I think about what excites me of, if I could wave my wand, it really is truly a resilient city that thinks about its ecology and how transportation falls into that. And so even for some of the things that we were piloting in Houston, we took one street and made it a green street. We made the entire street permeable pavers. It was a low volume road, and just testing it out to see how it performed, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a flat city with clay soil. So that water has nowhere to go. And you're trying to think creatively about where can we store water. And if we have asphalt and pavement, all over, and concrete all over the place, the water just can't flow like it needs to flow. As I think about a system, really great, high quality public transportation with very low headways, and then thinking about how we use our public right of way for things, around ecology, urban ecology, trees, green infrastructure, all that good stuff.
Yeah, great. I love that. And thanks for sharing what you would do with the magic wand. On that vein, I'm now going to ask you to gaze into a crystal ball, right? So really keen to hear from you around what's coming up on the horizon, and, what's the one game changer that you can see that could really transform the way people move?
The one game changer. I will say a huge game changer, if we can get focused, is the use of autonomous vehicles, but for transit. I think we get a little distracted sometimes, and at least in the US, we get very distracted by vehicles of we're going to have all of these great electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles and life will be better. And not really, we'll just have more efficient traffic and maybe a little bit cleaner air. But, to see transit agencies really stepping up and looking at autonomous shuttles, autonomous rail, autonomous buses, it really gets to be exciting, particularly since we already know we have a driver shortage across the nation, and it allows for being able to supplement some of those things. So I think if we can just stay focused, it could be a really great thing, because then it really does allow for you to have these headways that you need, because you're not worried about trying to get drivers for them. But we still got a ways to go to get there.
Yeah, we do. But I think just such an important point you make about what autonomous transport or automation can do for our future. So I want to change course, Veronica. I really want to talk now about leadership and your thoughts around that. And specifically, let's start talking about equity. In your book, you refer to equity being a prioritization of the greater need. And I really like that concept, and how developing guiding principles to assist with that prioritization exercise could be a method to achieving equity. And wanted to ask you, how would you, or how have you applied that kind of approach to striving for equity in the transportation industry as a leader?
So how I take that approach, again, it comes down to the greatest need. And the reason why I came up with that approach, we've all seen the graphic of equity versus equality. And, equity is everyone gets what they need. But there is no city anywhere across the globe that has the people, the funding, and the time to meet the needs of the community. And so that's where the prioritization comes in. When I look back at my time at the city of Houston, that was the framework that I worked from. It was, what are the areas with the greatest need? And so let's look at safety. A lot of cities now have adopted Vision Zero. And with that, Houston, like many cities, had the high injury network. And that is where we know people are regularly dying or being seriously injured because of traffic-related crashes. And, even beyond that, in Houston, it was, something like 60% of the high injury network was only on 6% of the roads. So you really have these roads that are like the highest of the high. And that's where we focused. And we submitted grant funding to the federal government for one of the streets, which is the most deadly street in the entire city, and was able to get $28 million from the federal government. And same with some other streets where they were the highest of the high. And so that's how I prioritize. And then when you layer ethnicity, race, and all those things, yes, they tend to be Black and brown communities overwhelmingly. And you have to be able to have that framework and hold the line, because there are people that may feel like, well, this is unsafe in my community. And while it may be safe, and I think as a whole with the transportation system, we can make a lot of things safer, it's being able to say, I hear you, but right now we are focused on the high injury network. And it's hard, but that is just an example of how that prioritization works.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing more about that. So Veronica, during this conversation, I've just really been blown away when you're talking about leadership. And I wanted to ask you about your own personal leadership. How would you describe your leadership style? And sorry, I know that sounds a little bit like a job interview question, but, how would you describe your style, and how do you make the magic happen? And I also wanted to ask, do you have a leadership practice?
Oh, my goodness. So I will say my leadership style is, I'm really a balance. It is about being the leader and the type of leader that is needed depending on the situation, and it's going to change. And when I look back at my time at the city of Houston, there were times when you have to lead by painting a vision for people so that they can see it. Here's where we are going. Here is the bigger vision. And then stepping back and letting them chart the path to get there. It's like, planning a vacation. We're going here, and letting them work through the details. And that was really great. There were times that, I had to sit down with the team and roll sleeves up and say, okay, how are we going to do this? And knowing when to use what type of skill. And then I had an operations function, which for me was very different. Engineering and planning is very slow. You have time. The average transportation plan is going to be 9 to 18 months just to get through. And then design is another 18 months to, years, depending on the project. But when you're in operations, you have to make decision with imperfect information in a matter of minutes. And, with that as a leader, it is being able to trust my team and let them know I have the confidence in them, because I now have to make this decision, but you are my eyes. You are on the ground. Tell me what you see. Tell me what you recommend. Tell me what your concerns are, and then being able to make a decision. So again, I have had to expand all my leadership skills in my most recent role, really to, match what the situation is and then match who I'm leading. Every person that works under you is different and their needs are different. Some you got to nurture them a little bit more. Some you can give, hey, I just need this, and they're gone and they can get it done. And so it really has evolved over time. And as I think about the importance of leadership, and I really want to hone the point that I made earlier, it is taking care of at-home financials, because it gave me the courage to be able to make the decisions that I make. I will say that as a leader, once that self-preservation begins to kick in, you're not going to be effective as a leader. And, self-preservation is human nature. And when you don't have the money to pay, your mortgage or your rent, your bills, that self-preservation kicks in and you make the convenient decision and not always the right decision. And so that has been a very kind of important leadership lesson that I've had, to make sure that I live below my means, that I have the financial means, that if I am ever thanked for my service, my household doesn't fall apart. And so that's just what I've gained, particularly over the last 3 years. The other thing I will add, to be an effective leader, you really have to understand people and to be able to read people. And some of that is where political savviness comes in, because what I had to do is I had to balance the political wills. I had to balance the community and balance my staff. And so with that, you always have to be able to communicate very technical things to people at a very high level. And so that just really becomes important. The more you know and understand people, the more you can tailor your communication to them in a way that they're able to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about people, isn't it? Right. That's at the heart of actually what the transport industry and sector is about. I just honestly am so inspired by what you've shared. And, you are such a powerful storyteller. It just comes out in everything I've asked you and what you've shared. And this concept of storytelling, or the art of storytelling, I think is something that's really kind of gained ground in leadership in recent years. And in your book, you have invited readers to reflect on their transportation story, after you shared your own. And I wanted to ask you, what advice do you have around that? How can women be reflecting on their leadership stories and incorporating those reflections into their practices?
One of the reasons why I invite the reader to reflect on their story is, as I just got through saying, understand people, but it also starts with understanding who you are and where you've been, why you make the decisions that you make. I think that there's times as planners and engineers, we have been trained on the data. The map says, the data says, the guidelines say, and that is what we use. However, we're still people. We're individuals. We all bring something different and unique. And part of that is the more you can bring yourself to the work, you can actually make an emotional connection with someone. Because nowadays, people don't always trust data. There's, the rise of anti-science, if you will. And so it's so important to be able to tell a story. The previous mayor of Houston was a masterful communicator, and I took all types of notes. We were at a project, it was very controversial, and people are just upset because it's just traffic is going to be everywhere. It's going to be gloom and doom. And so the mayor says, I hear you, but let's just say, let's just pretend. Okay, so what happens if everything you think is going to happen, but it doesn't happen? What happens if we do this project and nothing you said comes true? Wouldn't you agree that this is a great project? Wouldn't it be great if parents could walk with their kids or bike with their kids? Wouldn't you say that that's a great thing for this community? And again, it's no matter how much data we presented, it was that communication that resonated with that person, because it was the recognition of, I am afraid of this thing that I don't know is going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, yeah, this could be a good project. And so that's where it is important to bring that personal connection and not always lead with the data.
Yeah, wow. I really love that. Thank you so much, Veronica. Super appreciate you sharing that. I wanted to kind of talk a bit more about women in leadership. And And I'm keen actually to hear from you, right? So have you been supported in your career, by female leaders around you? Who do you look up to professionally, or have you been mentored or inspired by someone?
I have a army of mentors because I'm a lot, so I need a lot. I do have an army of people that I surround myself with that are different levels of their career. I have my peer group that I call my brain and my heart trust. I have the people who, have been there, done that. And it's a mixture of men and women. And I will say for me, I tend to gravitate to mentors who are the opposite of me. I am very loud. I am very energetic and boisterous and all of those things. And one mentor that I've known 20 years now, he's a very quiet leader, but he's a very good leader. And so that's an appeal to me of I'm never going to be quiet, but there are aspects of his leadership style that I emulate or use to balance. It's, taking the pieces that you need. And so I have absolutely had people who have been not just mentors, but truly champions of my career. One I will say is Karina Ricks. I will always have a Karina Ricks love fan. She used to work for the District Department of Transportation. She was the director of the Department of Mobility in the city of Pittsburgh. But actually, I've known her because she's a Cornell University alumni. And we had a trip to DC, and that was my first time meeting her. And what I appreciate about her is she's always willing to whisper my name, speak my name, provide me opportunity. Even when I had my company, we were able to do consulting work for the city of Pittsburgh. And I'm ever grateful and appreciative of her. And I don't want to start naming too many people because then I know I'm going to forget someone. But I will say I do have really great people that I surround myself with. And I hope that they feel that I show up for them the same way.
Veronica, how did you build the army? Like this concept of the army of mentors. I love that. But I hear from so many people, like they don't even know how to begin, like how to find a mentor. Do you have any advice?
Finding a mentor is, it's one of those things that it'll come organically. I think there are times when, people will do a formal mentorship program. But sometimes it's you just find people that you connect with. And I'll give an example. I have, my Heart Trust. I met them because I went to Salzburg Global Seminar, and that was our time to connect, to get to know each other and really understand each other professionally. And we're very different. We are 5 very different people, different personalities. We're all in different professions. But it is our differences that allow us to continue to grow together and give each other the space to talk about whatever, we need to talk about. And so we'll have Zoom meetings because we're all in different parts of the United States, but we'll have Zoom meetings where we can talk through things that we're going through. And we're there and we show up and we support each other. And so really it comes down to meeting people and connecting with people. For me, I like to connect with people that are just so different from me because I feel like those complementary skill sets make me a better person versus just being around people that are just like me, if that makes any sense. So yeah. I just tend to gravitate with people who are very different from me.
You were talking about how it's kind of happened organically for you. And I'm reflecting on earlier in the conversation where you were talking about how your career has kind of veered off the path. And I wanted to ask you about, do you plan your career or have you just kind of taken these opportunities organically as they've come?
Michelle, I have absolutely not planned my career.
Yeah.
If we were going to plan my career, I was supposed to be a professional dancer because I wanted to go to Juilliard in New York City for college. So nothing has been planned. It's been one of these things where I really feel like I was born into this work. And every time I tried to run away from it, I kept ending up right back into it. So I never, as a high school student, I should say, I never thought I would be here. When I was 22 years old, though, I wrote this life strategic plan. I was working for the New York City Department of Transportation as an intern. And I wrote this, what I call this life strategic plan. And in there, I wanted to be a world-renowned transportation expert. And that is what I wrote at 22. And I had all these things that I was going to do that was going to define me as an expert. I was going to get a PhD. Well, I went to get a PhD and I didn't finish. I took coursework and I was like, got what I need. I don't need to do anymore. But I had a framework and I veered off for different decisions. But it's almost kind of like, I'm really into Marvel. I don't know if you're into Marvel, Michelle, but there's the whole like multiverse of madness. And it's like there's multiple ways that you can go and you might still end up in the same place. And so even every kind of branch of my multiverse, I think about the skills that I gained and all of that. And while maybe a different decision would have led to a different outcome, I feel like I'm right where I need to be right now.
Oh, I love that. And I love the Marvel reference, actually. I'm big on the superheroes. I have been since I was a kid. So, Veronica, what's next for you?
What is next for me? There's an author I really like. Her name is Octavia Rahim, and she has a book called Pause, Rest, Be. And she has a thing called the liminal space, and that's the space between an ending and a beginning. And that's where I am right now. I am really just taking rest. And real rest, not just sleep rest, but really taking the time to read, taking the time to be outside, even on colder days, to be around nature, to take things in, to slow down a little bit, to kind of almost reset my nervous system. Because as I mentioned, when you're in an operations role, you never really settle down because when you're operations, anything can happen at any time. You can get a call at midnight, you can have a call at 4 a.m. And so you never really settle down. So it's like you're in a constant state of fight or flight. So what's next for me right now is I am just in this space. I am having some peace, having some rest, and then eventually I will get back in the game.
I love that for you. I really hope you enjoy your rest. You absolutely deserve it, with all of that you've shared in terms of your achievements in career. I've got one more question. It's the question I always end on. What is your top piece of advice for people who are early on in their career in the public transport and mobility sector?
Ooh, top piece of advice. I have two. So I know I've said it a few times and I'm going to repeat it again. Always live below your means. You want to have financial cushion. You want to have a very healthy emergency fund. And particularly as your salary grows, you want to make sure that you are rooted financially, because as you move into these higher level positions, there is less guarantee. There's less guarantee that you will be in that position. And, I really believe to be an effective leader, you have to be willing to be selfless. And in order to be selfless, you have to know that your home is taken care of, because that self-preservation is going to kick in. The other thing I will say, and I do talk about this in the book, is really exercise your empathy muscle. I think that as we look at the discourse online, many of us miss the empathy lesson growing up, but it is really important to continue every day to work your empathy muscle. And part of that is really taking the time to do things that decenter you and your identity. And the example that I give, I do my best while I do walk through this world as a Black woman. And there are things that come with that. But even with that, there's opportunities for me still to decenter my identities and even my intersectionality. And, one of the things that I do is I follow a lot of people in the disability communities, the different disability communities, because they're all different, they all unique and have unique sets of challenges. And it is about being a quiet observer. I don't need to take up space in the discourse, but being a quiet observer to learn, to understand what are the challenges. And so that is, if you think about the deaf and hard of hearing community and the differences within that community, you think about people with wheelchairs and all of that, and you will learn a lot and it will help you challenge your own assumptions. In a very specific example, there was a conversation happening within the disability community recently, and it was about sex. And so there's this assumption that we have that, disabled people don't have sex. And I'm not saying everybody, but it's something you don't think about. And you really have to challenge that assumption. And I know that's very different from transportation, but it's about really taking the time to realize that you have assumptions about a group of people, mainly because you just never thought about it, or you think it's the opposite of you. So it's really, really intentionally exercising that empathy muscle.
Wow, I just love that. Thank you so much for sharing so generously, Veronica, your advice and your story throughout this episode of Women Who Move Nations. We're at the end. I really appreciate you taking your time. And I just want to say best of luck for your rest and what comes next in your career. And I look forward to following it.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. That was Veronica Davis, self-proclaimed transportation nerd, and most recently the Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations at the City of Houston in Texas in the United States. Thanks for listening to this episode of Women Who Move Nations, and I look forward to our next episode soon.
Thank you for listening to Women Who Move Nations, the public transport podcast.
This series is produced by Jamie Lee Owen and Sophia Dickinson for the Public Transport Association Australia and New Zealand.
To find out more, please visit our website, ptaanz.org. Tune in for more soon.